If people wanted to shed stubborn fat, Mike, how can walking help with this? And what is the right method of walking to make this more efficient?
Ben, great question. I think people need to think about walking as a mandatory aspect of their lifestyle, irrespective of whatever diet or fasting program they're doing. Various studies have been emerging over the past, I want to say 5 or 6 years, finding that the threshold for the number of steps that we should be walking every day is right around 9,000. So that's what people should aim for. Other studies show about 12,000 for preventing different diseases. And these are common conditions. There was a huge meta-analysis involving 1.3 million people finding that if you walk at least 8,600 steps per day, you can avoid and reduce your risk of developing all sorts of conditions from sleep apnea to depression to high blood pressure, improving metabolic health, reducing visceral fat. So that's really important. But getting back to your question specifically about losing belly fat, we should be breaking our walks up into what I consider, and researchers talk about this, exercise snacks. So having 3 or 4 2,500 step sessions interspersed throughout the day. So, people are always wondering like, well, will coffee break my fast? Will this or that break my fast? Walking actually helps you trigger the autophagy mechanisms that are some of the health benefits linked with fasting. We can get into the sort of synergy between exercise and autophagy and the parallels with fasting later. But to get real granular with this, 3 to 4 2,500 or 3,000 step sessions. And so what that might look like is before you have breakfast in the morning. A lot of people fast in the morning. A lot of your listeners do that. Just go out and get 2,500, 3,000 steps, and then around after lunchtime, after your first major meal, get another 3,000 steps. And then after dinner, you get 3,000. And if you do these little exercise breaks, it's actually more effective than just going to the gym and doing, say, 45 minutes on a treadmill or a 45-minute walk. So interspersing exercise and walking throughout the day is better than just doing one bout of exercise. And I like to share the research from a gentleman known as his name is 𝙈𝙊𝙍𝙍 at UT Austin, and he's published many randomized controlled trials where they randomize subjects to either a low step count group, medium step count, and high step count. And to enumerate those step counts, we're talking 2,600 steps for a whole day. So just relegating people to a lab where they're only walking with their pedometer 2,500 steps. And then they randomize people to either walk 4,500 steps or 9,000 steps. And then what they do after this is, I think, over the course of 2 and 4 days, depending upon which study they publish, they've done a few of these different trials. Then after those interventions, they will give the subjects a standardized high fat test meal. And they'll look at markers of fat oxidation as well as post-meal hypertriglyceridemia. So I know you talk a lot about lipids and biomarkers. High post-meal triglycerides are a strong independent risk factor of future heart disease as well as metabolic deterioration, and it's a proxy of poor fat utilization and handling and poor fat oxidation. So you don't want a strong high post-meal triglyceride level. That would suggest that you have some degree of poor metabolic health. And so what the investigators found is when people do not walk at least 8,000 steps per day after the standardized test meal, they have an exaggerated post-meal level of their blood triglycerides, which, as I mentioned,
Wow.
very problematic, arguably worse than LDL cholesterol, which we can get into later. And the differential in fat oxidation between the low step count group, again, most people are just walking about 2,000, 3,000 steps per day. They get up, they walk, they go to the car, they drive to work, they get in the office, they sit all day, then they drive home and watch TV. And so most people are pretty sedentary. And there was a 30% reduction when comparing the high step count group, around 8,500 steps, compared to the 2,600 step count. So if we think about just 2 days, and this is, some people might be traveling, going to Yosemite or Yellowstone with the family, they're in an RV, Winnebago, they're eating chips and hot dogs and things like that, sitting around or on an airplane. So we do this people do this all the time, and we wonder why we can't lose fat. And this is one very simple way to just improve your body's ability to burn fat. Because going further, what the study did is they also, in one arm of the study, they had individuals do a 60-minute zone 2 exercise session, which, as we know, zone 2 is actually, I don't think it's the best for long-term fat loss, but when you're doing zone 2 low intensity cardio, you tend to, the body relies more upon burning fat for fuel to give your muscles energy during that exercise session. there wasn't a statistically significant increase in fat oxidation in the low step count group, meaning
Mm.
that if people don't walk a lot, but they go to the gym, they're not getting the most mileage from that gym session because they're not just doing these daily activities of daily living that are supporting fat oxidation. So yeah, to be very concise, 3 to 4 sessions, walking sessions of 2,500 to 3,000 steps interspersed throughout the day. And honestly, Ben, this is great for mental focus. I mean, you can only focus on a one finite task for a short period of time, and so this just really helps break up the day. You feel better, you digest your food better. We can get into the circadian rhythm health because I encourage people to walk outside, even on a cloudy day. The intensity of the sun, the lux, is well over 1,000, which really helps to entrain your circadian clock system and foster that sleep pressure later in the day. So there's a bunch of different health benefits, but yeah, it really helps people lose a lot more belly fat.
I'm sold. I have been sold for quite some time. You broke it down so well, and the evidence, this research is clear that it's beneficial, especially when you chunk it out. So 9,000 steps per day seems to be the target. I tend to get around 12 or 13,000 on average per day, and it's chunked. It's not in one long workout. So I tend to do that naturally with my day to day. It's the benefit of having a dog, by the way. I walk him at least twice a day, so I get outside. You mentioned going for a walk after dinner. I'd love for you to share the benefits of going for a walk after eating maybe a higher carb meal, of what it does to kind of blunt that postprandial glucose.
Yeah, this is amazing. And the way that I sort of figured this out, I mean, obviously there's research to show this, but back when continuous glucose monitors, the Abbott Freestyle came on the market back in 2017, I had been doing keto, eating a low carb diet since 2014, got into it. And I was like, kind of curious, like if I were to go to a vegan restaurant here in Seattle, I just Googled the most popular vegan restaurant. My family went in there and we just said, hey, we've never been here before. Give us the most popular items on the menu. And it was, pizza and some breads and some different things. And I'm testing my glucose in real time. I calibrated the glucose monitor and so forth. And I could see my glucose start to continuously increase to 185 milligrams per deciliter. And so for
Wow.
folks listening, that is in the pre-diabetic range. Now, I know that might sound alarming. People are like, well, you're diabetic. It's like, no, I had been used to eating a low carb diet for a while. And research shows this. When you get habitually accustomed to eating a low carb diet and then you have a very high carb meal, your body can have an over exaggerated response to that meal. And that's exactly what happened. And, I was like, oh my gosh, we need to go for a walk to get this down. And no kidding, Ben, I went for my usual 1 mile walk with the dogs, came back and my glucose went from 185 to 85 milligrams per deciliter. And I made a video
Wow.
on this and I was just blown away. We hear all the time about exercise is good for fat loss. Exercise helps with blood flow. Exercise, helps reduce glucose and improve the peaks and troughs in glucose levels. But in real time, I was able to see this and I thought, wow, this is really powerful. And it really speaks to when you go to other parts of the world. I know some of your audience lives outside of North America, but most are relegated to North America. That's just kind of how YouTube works. And, when you go to Europe and other places, people just walk. They don't have cars and things like this. They have public transportation, but, people are walking in this, but yet they're eating bread and baguettes and pasta. You're like, well, why don't we see the obesity in parts of Europe where they do have a relatively high carbohydrate diet? And my hypothesis is they're just walking more. They're just more active and moving around more. So that I think is really important. So if someone does have a cheat meal, someone listening is going to go to a birthday or a wedding or have a barbecue, and there might be temptations with a hot dog or some chips or some ice cream or whatever. If you just go for a vigorous walk for 15, 20 minutes, that's all it takes. You can literally cut your glucose in half by doing that. And obviously there's many health benefits too, because insulin, if you are normally low carb and then you have a high glucose or high calorie meal, you're going to have an over exaggerated insulin response to that. And we know there's downsides to insulin in terms of facilitating atherosclerosis and the formation of plaque in your arteries, inflammation, immune suppression. There's a long list. And so by just helping your body do what insulin would normally do and put glucose into your muscles, by moving your muscles, you're causing them to absorb that glucose. And we already know this. In the post-meal window, about 80% of glucose is deposited in skeletal muscle. So if you just add some stimulus there by walking, because people don't think about muscle as an organ. It's an organ just like your thyroid, just like your liver, just like your pancreas. But in order for this organ to work, it needs stimulation. And so we need to stimulate this organ through activity. And that's where exercise really comes in. And people don't think that walking is an exercise, but it really is. You're moving those muscles. And I will tell you, there's research out of Copenhagen. Researchers in Denmark outside of Copenhagen have done studies finding that in diabetics, the leg muscles become insulin resistant before the musculature in the upper body. And I know people go to the gym, they lift chest and biceps, and I do that stuff too. I like lifting weights, but you need a lot of stimulation in your legs because for some reason they become sort of disease-like before the musculature in the upper body. And I would argue that part of that is because we have, through natural selection and just how humans are either hunting historically, ancestrally, hunting or gathering. We're moving. We're never meant to sit in our cars for 3 hours a day in rush hour traffic or sit in desks. We should be moving. And this is one of the things, if you look at the blue zone research, we're hearing so much push about, well, you got to go on a plant-based diet because see, these blue zones eat more plants than meat, depending upon the blue zone. So therefore the plant-based diet is the key here. It's the sine qua non of longevity. Well, not so fast. These blue zone areas are also characterized by a lot of recreational activity. In Sardinia, in parts of Costa Rica, in Japan, these people move. They don't sit in their cars. They're moving throughout the day, having these so-called exercise snacks. So again, if you have a cheat meal, go for a brisk walk. It will literally cut your glucose levels almost in half.
So good, Mike. There's a lot to unpack there. With the blue zone conversation, there's so many moving parts outside of what you just said, right? They also have community. They practice gratitude. And I had Mary Rudick here a couple months ago. I interviewed her. Are you familiar with Mary Rudick at all? Mm-hmm. She's been to all the blue zones. She's done a lot of research, super smart woman. And she told me every single blue zone, she visited and stayed with all of them for months. They all had animal products, whether there was the vegetables cooked in the butter or the beef tallow or whatever it was, but they all consumed animal products. There wasn't one that was 100% strictly plant-based. With the walking, there's so many benefits that you explained, but I always tell my students, I know it's maybe not realistic to go for a walk after every meal, but if you could do it after your biggest meal, maybe the meal that has the most carbohydrates, you'll get the biggest benefit. And to your point with your experiment, 185 milligrams per deciliter down to 85 in an hour just by going for a 1 mile walk. Tremendous. And I think about the Italy and the Europe, the disease and the obesity rates and their life expectancy and how it's so much better there than it is now. And I agree with you that they are walking more. They also have more community and enjoy themselves. But also in 2016, they banned glyphosate and all these artificial dyes. And I think that's a big part of it too. We're still allowing all this crap that you show on your Instagram feed all the time. We're allowing this crap. The FDA is allowing this in our food supply, while Europe, Italy, they've banned it. And they eat, I believe, 30% more carbohydrates. They have a longer life expectancy. They have a quarter of the amount of gyms we have in the US, yet they're healthier and leaner. So I think it is a lot of different variables with Europe.
Well, to go one step further, they smoke like it's 1970s. I mean, it's insane. True. I just got back from France a couple of weeks ago. Every restaurant has an ashtray on it. I mean, it's insane. Young kids, I was at a park. We were doing pull-ups in a park and just trying to get a little workout here because there is not a lot of gyms, like you said, Ben. And there's a kid that was like not much older than my daughter, about 13, and he's just ripping on this vape pen. And he didn't speak English, but his friends did. And I was like, should I say anything? I'm like, I should say something. This kid doesn't know the harms of vaping at such a young age. And he was kind of watching me do pull-ups. We had our shirts off and everything. I was like, hey, does your dad know that you vape? And his friend had to translate it in French and then go back to me in English. And he's like, no. I'm like, please tell your friend this is really bad for his growth. I was trying to appeal to a young man. What would affect a young, like motivate, like he's
Smart.
going probably affect his growth, and and all his friends were like, see, even he says, don't do it. As American says it's bad. And he kind of like had a look on him like, yeah. And he put the pen in his pocket. Hopefully he'll change. But the point is, Europeans, to your point, Ben, they're doing a lot of things wrong, but paradoxically, they're living so much longer, and you don't see the obesity. The rates of heart disease, I mean, if you look at the proportion of the population that has death from heart disease in Europe or parts of France, Italy, compared to here, significantly lower. And it raises a lot of questions because, again, to your point, there's a lot of fat and animal fat and meat. I mean, I didn't see a lot of vegetarian or vegan options. When I went to restaurants and in grocery stores and things like that, there's a lot of bread, a lot of carbs, animal fats, red meat. You see young women eating red meat and having burgers and this and smoking. So part of that, I think, is the psychosocial aspect of it, the community, the socialization. I feel like we are very socially isolated here in the US and don't really communicate with people outside of screens. But then the nature and the walking, there's a lot to it. And like you said, the additives in the food obviously make a big difference. But we can learn from this. It doesn't mean we should all go out and start smoking or vaping. But I think if we try to live a lifestyle that mirrors some of that and spending time in nature, spending time with friends, just going to a coffee shop or going to a friend's house and just talking without your phone out, that actually has health benefits. So
Yeah, right on, right on. We can learn a lot from them. But so step number one for those looking to burn fat, optimize their glucose levels, insulin, and just overall metabolic health, get 9,000 steps per day. And if you could chunk it up to 3 to 4 different sessions, that's going to be the best way to do it. Have you seen any research showing that? I think you said 12,000. There was some research showing there were some, what was it, cardiovascular benefits? What was the research showing there?
Yeah, so this was a meta-analysis published last year by a gentleman, Bannock et al. And this was published, I want to say it was Nature Reviews Cardiology, or it was a major high-impact journal. And they analyzed all the different studies. There's been a lot of long-term studies looking at different, like the UK Biobank and here the Nurses Health Initiative and Physicians Health Follow-Up Study. There's all these different cohorts and finding using accelerometer data or pedometers of people that have wrist, the ability to enumerate step count. And what they found is that there was a strong statistical association when comparing low step count people to groups, to high groups, and then using statistical modeling to also look at medical health records and finding that when people have reported on their pedometers more than 9,000 steps per day, they have statistically lower odds of having osteoarthritis, depression, asthma, sleep apnea, gastrointestinal reflux disorder. I mean, the list goes on. I mean, basically all the stuff that people are going to the doctor for because they feel unwell can be ameliorated in part through walking. And so we now have tons of research to really support this. So I think this should be something that all doctors and frontline health professionals are working on. It makes your supplements work better because the more physically fit you are, your berberine is going to work better, or your fish oil, or your magnesium, fill in the blank. A lot of people can't sleep, so they're slamming magnesium, but the best way to create sleep pressure is to get sunshine and to move your body, and so there's a lot of carryover here. And I think it's low hanging fruit. And I don't know, maybe people see elderly in the neighborhood walking, so they think, oh, that can be that effective. It's not for me, but this is something that, young people should do, old people. It's had a lot of carryover. I'm just talk personally. My daughter is running at nationals next week and is seeded eighth for the 1,500 meter run, which is basically a mile. And all we've been doing her whole life is just walking, hiking and walking. And so she has built up this really dense base of capillary and mitochondrial function that has now enabled her, it's her first year running track, to become an elite runner. And so she hasn't ran at all up until she was 11 years old this last year. So there's a lot of benefits here, and you can get the family involved. You talk to young kids now and like, what do you do at night? Oh, I'm on my phone. Why not go out for a walk or go for a hike? I mean, these things are really beneficial. getting a little off topic here, but Steve Jobs, he would have meetings. Everyone knows, creator of the Apple, the iStore, the App Store, the iPhone, like really great mind, great innovator. He wouldn't have meetings at a desk job over Zoom. He'd take, people, developers, engineers, and they would go for like a 45-minute walk, because you do your best thinking there. If you ever have a challenge in your relationship, instead of be kind of competitive or confrontational face to face, we tend to do that. Just go for a walk and be like, hey, look, you doing this thing makes me feel a certain way, or I know you feel off because I do this and I'm sorry. You can really have a less confrontational conversation. And so I think we should just be incorporating this into our culture at scale.
I agree, Mike. And I remember reading a book maybe in 2017, 2018 called Spark, the Science Behind Exercise in the Brain.
It
started
right back there, actually.
Oh, do you have it back there? Yeah.
Right there.
Such a great book. And it started off talking about this school in Naperville, Illinois, and how, this wasn't like the school that was like the high-end private school that a lot of parents were paying a lot of money for their children to go there. It was kind of like in the average of private schools, but they kept scoring the best test grades, A+. They had the best averages with their students, and they wanted to determine, what's so special about these students. And it turns out they were requiring them to do physical education, PE, before they started their classes, right? Because it helped boost brain-derived neurotrophic factor, all the other benefits he spoke about. So if you want to be productive, to Mike's point, whether you're a mom, an entrepreneur, a business person, whatever it is, if you just want to be more productive, getting this morning walk in every single morning has the potential to help you stay more sharp and focused for the rest of the day. What a fascinating book. And I know we've had so much more research come out on BDNF, especially fasting could help it. But that was the first book that I learned the connection between exercise and brain function.
It's amazing. And to take that one step further, Ben, not specifically about the brain, but because we know fasting and autophagy does impact brain health, walking and exercise make autophagy and I should say, let me go back. Walking and exercise enhance the health benefits of fasting and make fasting more effective. I like to share this when I do presentations on stage, especially when fasting was really, really popular back in 2018, 2019. It still is today, but many people are, doing 5-day fasts or 7-day water fasts or, 36-hour fasts all the time. And when you look at a study, and I can share this so that you can put it in the show notes, it tracked individuals who were overweight and did a 36-hour fast. And then they had a subset of subjects who were lean and physically fit and recreationally active. They went to the gym, they worked out, they walked, they had a high VO2 max. So that's how they were able to differentiate fitness. And these were age matched. So it wasn't like there were some really old people and young people. It was age matched VO2 max, and they stratified people that way. And so the people that had the high VO2 max, after just 18 hours of fasting, they had markers of autophagy initiation proteins, ATG1, ATG17. It gets complex, but this is how researchers ascertain whether or not autophagy is being initiated upon fasting. The people who had a high VO2 max because they exercised had markers of autophagy initiation so much higher at just 18 hours compared to the sedentary people who didn't exercise at 36 hours. So if you walk and if you exercise and do the things that we've been talking about, you don't have to double down on fasting as much. And I think that's really, basically it makes fasting more efficient is what I'm trying to say here, because we think fasting and autophagy, well, that parallel, those mechanisms with exercise, part of how our muscles repair from the damage of exercise is by way of autophagy. So when we think about autophagy, instead of just thinking fasting, think also exercise. Both modalities upregulate this important longevity enhancing process known as autophagy. So I think that's really important, especially to the fasting community, because people are like, oh, I don't need to exercise, I fast. It's like, no, you should exercise because it makes your fasting so much more effective and efficient.
So true. I know that I feel the best when I do a fasted workout like I did this morning, but I am also really intentional with getting enough amino acids and protein when I'm have my eating window, especially because I'm looking to actually build some muscle personally. Yes. But so you're saying, Mike, that if somebody fasted 36 hours, but they were sedentary, the levels of autophagy they achieved might be the same as somebody who fasted 18 hours, but was really active during the 18 hours.
Well, this study found the people who were sedentary and fasted 36 hours didn't even hit the same level of autophagy initiation compared to people who are physically active and only the people that were physically fit also fasted 36 hours as well. But the degree of autophagy initiation protein markers happened earlier, just at 18 hours into the fast is what I'm trying to say here. So essentially, when you're physically fit, you get so much more. If we're trying to look at autophagy as a proxy of the health benefits linked with fasting, it makes that process happen sooner in the fast and to a much higher degree compared to if we're not fit, if we don't exercise. That's the point. So we really, if you're like, look, I need to lose a bunch of weight, I have a wedding coming up, I'm going to do a 5-day fast. Well, you should also start exercising now so that 5-day fast is much more effective in terms of, because the thing about exercise, it's muscle sparing too. One of the downsides of fasting is it, there is a growth hormone surge and some periodic spikes in growth hormone, but everyone knows, you do lose a little bit of muscle mass when you fast. Like I don't care what other people say. You lose strength and you lose some muscle mass. I mean, I think that's well recognized at this point. So one way to mitigate that, because exercise is anti-catabolic, there's two ways to mitigate the loss of muscle. You're going to have protein or insulin, which is counterproductive to have when you're fasting, or you could exercise. Exercise has anti-catabolic effects. And so that's the thing that you can do to increase muscle protein synthesis, even independent of the amino acids, the dearth of amino acids during a fasting session. So people should still exercise, should still walk, do these same step counts that we've been talking about, even on a 3 or 5-day fast.
I'd love for you to share a little bit more about the fasting and muscle loss conversation, because I'm personally still kind of looking at different research and not 100% certain on what's happening here. Because I've seen some research showing that most of what is lost is volume, not mass. And just a few days ago, I had Dr. Fung back on the show, and he's telling me that it is mostly water. It's mostly glycogen. It's not necessarily strength and muscle. And when they're doing these studies and they're testing like with the bioimpedance, it's not giving you the full picture and what happens when you break the fast and refeed. So I'd love for you to break that down a little bit more. Are we actually losing strength and muscle mass, or is it volume, and is it coming back after we refeed with amino acids?
Yeah, Ben, it's a great question. And sadly, we don't have a lot of randomized controlled trials to really support these things. We generally have to rely upon anecdotal reports of people. We can look at the work of the Minnesota fasting experiment with Ansel Keys. Actually, I know he has a bad rap in the keto community because of his work with the 7-country studies and generating this now sort of refuted hypothesis about the lipid cardiovascular disease model, and so forth. But Ansel Keys did do there's a bunch of good books on this for lay people about the Minnesota starvation experiment. And what he found is that when individuals have relatively low amounts of body fat, prolonged fasting, you have to get the energy from somewhere. And so if you have really low body fat, that energy is going to start to dip into muscle. And so you will,
what percentage is that? Like what, like 5%, 3%? It's somewhere in the single digits.
I don't know the thresholds. I really don't. But I think, if you're sub 12% body fat as a man and maybe 17% body fat as a woman, and you're doing a really long fast, you're probably going to lose some skeletal muscle. Now, can you get that back? Yeah, sure. Like absolutely. But in my opinion, because I used to do a lot of 3 to 5-day fasts.
I remember.
This was my jam. I was so excited about this. I've been to Toronto twice, interviewed Jason Fung. I used to work out there, and I would just bake in fasting to my travel plans. It saved time. I didn't have to eat. I was kind of in the fasting high ketones. It was amazing. Then I started, to go back to do my normal gym routines, and I would work out when I traveled, and I was just like so weak. And I'm like, what is going on here? And then so I just was like, had to be honest with myself. Like, you know what? I don't think that this is the best thing for maintaining strength and muscle, so I have since scaled back and do like a 1-day 24-hour or 18-hour fast, basically on Mondays. That's been my thing for a lot of years, and just again, this is anecdotal N of 1. My body fat hovers around 13% most of the year. I can get down in the summer when I'm hiking a lot around 12, but around that point. And I found, at least for me, I'm just speaking, I can't say this as for a population wide, analysis, definitely lost muscle and strength. And so it's a lot easier for me now to maintain muscle and strength. And here's the thing for me, why does that really matter, Mike? You're not a paid bodybuilder. I don't make any money off my physique, but mentally, our self-perception of aging impacts our pace of biologic aging. And not to deviate too much, but there's been a 40-year study out of New Zealand called the Dunedin study. And one of the most strongest associations with the increased pace of biologic aging, let me just pause just real quick. I'll be 42 next month, right? Chronologically, I'm 42. My cells could be 39 or they could be 45. They could be 50. It just depends on my pace of biologic aging. And after reading and following this Dunedin study, which is incredibly fascinating, one of the strongest predictors of the pace of biologic aging is negative perception of aging. It's all in your head. So if you look in the mirror and think, gosh, I'm getting smaller, weaker, and older, that is going to be that's going to be counterproductive to aging more gracefully. So I like to be strong and think in my head like I'm just as strong, and I am now as strong as I was when I was playing football in high school when I was 18. So that, to me, in my opinion, means more than to be like, yeah, I can do 5-day fasts all the time and I'm super skinny and frail and weak. Like, I just was like, gosh, I'm getting older, man. I was in my third. I'm like, I can't lift weights like I used to. It just must be aging. Like, and I started to have like a negative perception of how I was aging. So I'm like, so I don't do that. So that's just me. Everyone's different. If someone has had cancer before, if someone has first degree relatives that have died from cancer and they're really concerned about, breast cancer and some of the cancers that are impacted by glucose metabolism, colon, pancreatic, brain cancer. I get it. I understand why you want to fast and so forth, but that's not my goal here. I just want to be around for my daughter and hopefully grandkids and be healthy as I can and pain-free. So that's just what I've found. Now, going back to the mechanisms here, again, what the research does show, is in an energy deficit, in dieting bodybuilders, in fasting, you name it, muscle mass, the rate of muscle mass loss varies based upon the percentage of body fat. It can be as low as 15% of the total weight loss during a calorie deficit or fasting period, up to as much as 40%. And the way that we mitigate that is through anti-catabolic measures. And so we talked about how exercise is anti-catabolic. And so if you're going to do extended fasting, I would make sure to do periodic push-ups, do some air squats, do some pull-ups, do some walking. That might help mitigate some of that. And so anyway, that was a very long way to answer your question. Hopefully we addressed some of your questions there.
No, you did. And it makes a lot of sense. And I want to take a quick break from the video you're watching to share something with you that has made a big difference with my health and the thousands and thousands of students that I teach all across the world. Now, this is a unique device that has been shown to help with skin health, sore muscles, wrinkles, psoriasis, eczema, scoliosis, migraines, sleep issues, arthritis, acne, scar tissue, wound healing, relaxation, and also boost testosterone levels. It's red light therapy. Turn it on, and as you can see, I just leave it there on my desk as I work. 10, 20 minutes per day will suffice. Then head over to bondcharge.com/KetoCamp and use the coupon code KetoCamp to get 15% off your red light device. So whether it's these Bond Charge blue light blocking glasses, their sauna blanket, or any of their awesome products, use that coupon code KetoCamp at checkout. We'll drop a link down below. Go check them out. They're awesome. And let's get back to today's video. Very similar to your story. I was very much into long fast, 5-day fast, 3-day fast, and I was doing it every quarter or so many, many years ago, 2018, 2019. And it was taking a toll on me too, where I kind of scaled that back, where now I'm doing more of like a 16-8 or an 18-6, and then I'll throw in, if I'm traveling, I'll fast like during a travel day, 24 hours. And I have not been doing these longer fasts, but I have been doing fasted workouts. 95% of all my workouts are in the fasted state. I feel better. I get the benefits of activating more autophagy and all the things that you mentioned. I love what you shared about how you perceive your health influences your lifespan. I'm actually in the middle of finishing a book, and there's a chapter called how your thoughts influence your metabolism and your health. And there's a study that I was looking at. I don't have it memorized yet, so I'm going to read it here from my book here. But in 1981, I don't know if you heard of this before, Mike, but Ellen Langer, she was a psychologist. Have you heard of her research at all? Mm-mm. So to your point, this was a study done in 1981, and what she did, she took 8 men over the age of 70, And they took an old building, and her students transformed the building to make it look like it was the year 1959, even though it was the year 1981. They took 8 men over the age of 70, and they had them live there for 5 years, and they instructed them to live as if they were 22 years younger, like it was 1959. So they were treated as if they were in their 50s. They were not given any physical assistance, even when it was difficult. They were told to carry all their belongings upstairs, even one shirt at a time if necessary, to reinforce their younger self-image. The goal was to see if mentally living in a younger era could trigger physical improvement. So at the end of the study, the men showed improvements in hearing, eyesight, memory, dexterity, and appetite. And they said those who needed canes walked without them, and all participants displayed increased independence and vitality. So it's to your point, like I think we don't even understand yet how powerful those thoughts that we have every single day and how we perceive our health or lack thereof determines our fate in life.
Yes. Ben, this is beautiful. I need to read that article. I think that is really telling. And I think that's why fitness, in my opinion, I'm very biased, I realize, but I think that's why fitness is so important because, and especially if you've had a history of being fit, so like some of your objective strengths or output on different exercises, whether it's sprinting performance or push-ups or what have you. Really important for the memory, for the mind, and for just perception of yourself and self-identity. And we can go on. There's numerous studies that find that people that don't exercise are more depressed, more overweight, have more anxiety, all these different aspects. But even getting more, sort of tangible to how exercise impacts common conditions such as heart disease. There was a 10-year follow-up study in firefighters out of Indiana. And this was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA, really high impact, reputable journal. What they did is at the start of the study, they had people do as many push-ups as they can over the course of 90 seconds. So there was a investigator there with a stopwatch, said, hey, look, and if you can't do any more, just kind of sit there and in the, prone position, and then just maybe bang out one or two more, and just as many as you can, right? And what they found is the subjects that could only do 11 push-ups at day zero of the study, compared to people who could do 40 or more push-ups, and they had a 15-year age range. So they calculated or adjusted for age in the final analysis. They found that there was over a 20% relative risk increase in cardiac death and death from heart disease in people who could only do 11 push-ups. Now, these are men, and I know women listening are like, well, what about the females? So I think you can adjust for this by cutting the numbers roughly in half or so, or maybe 30 to 40%, shave that off a little bit. But basically the inability to just do basic physical functioning. And I think 40 push-ups in 90 seconds is a fair amount, especially if you don't work out, right?
40, you said?
Yeah. And they could pause, for a little bit, but just couldn't sit down and take a breath and then go back. They had to stay in the push-up position.
Yep.
So, and this was the follow-up study of 10 years. And what I thought was interesting, because we hear so much about cholesterol and how LDL cholesterol, it's made by your liver to just go cause atherosclerosis. So we need it as low as possible. Young kids even should be on statins. I mean, I read the literature on some of the things that primary health professionals read, like WebMD and Medscape and these things. And a new theory is lower is better. And we should start intervening earlier, such as in teenagers, because that's like a critical window of exposure. Yeah, the thinking goes. But what was interesting in this study, was when you looked at LDL cholesterol levels, there were no significant differences in the people who died from heart disease over the course of the 10 years versus those who didn't. But what was different was, of course, push-up capacity, as well as metabolic biomarkers like insulin resistance proxies such as hemoglobin A1C and glucose, and this triglycerides as well. So it just goes back to, I think our system really needs an overhaul, and doctors should be prioritizing, majoring in the majors, not the minors. And I think LDL is kind of it is an important, it does cause, LDL is implicated in the cardiophathophysiology of heart disease, right? It's involved for sure, but there are many other factors that are initiating the atherogenesis aspect of LDL cholesterol that we can get into. But yeah, strength really matters. And so I think if someone is listening and they look in the mirror and they're like, wow, I'm not aging that well. They should start focusing on exercise. I know a lot of people in their 50s who, when individuals find out they're 50, they're like, no way, you're 50? And guess what? These people walk, they exercise, they eat low carb diets, they're living healthy lifestyles. I mean, look at Sean Baker, for example, and
Yeah.
Mark Bell, Ken Berry. I mean, these people look so much better than their age matched peers who do not live the way that they live.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Including my mentor, Dr. Pompa, too. I think he's 58. His cells are like 45, talking about the biological versus chronological. I do want to talk more about LDL and cholesterol, and you're writing a new book all about this. So we're going to circle back to that.
Sure.
I want to stay still on the topic of fat loss here.
Yep.
One of the things that we see on social media out there, there's so many different people disagreeing with each other. Yeah. It's like, you could be keto forever. No, go in and out of ketosis. No, do carnivore. No, have fruit with carnivore. No, be plant-based. There's all these disagreements out there. But I think most health practitioners would agree that having healthy mitochondria is a really good thing. And when you exercise, when you move your body, whether it's walking or strength training or sprinting, it's one of the best ways to beneficially, hormetically stress your mitochondria so they adapt and get healthier. Can you explain more about what is happening at the mitochondrial level? And if you could link that to the metabolism and fat loss.
Yeah, great question, Ben. So as many of your listeners know, where we actually oxidize fat is inside the mitochondria, in fact. And so this is a really important organelle. And so if we think about ourselves like little houses, we have, hundreds of millions of little houses in our body. And in our house, we have specialized little systems. We have furnaces, to heat up the air in the winter. We have air conditioning units. We have our oven. We have our refrigerator, water heater, right? So inside your cells, you have this organelle, this organ-like structure that participates in biologic functions and specifically generating cellular energy. So the reason why we talk about burning fat and how exercise is helpful in the context of fat oxidation is because our muscles can't directly utilize fats or glucose for fuel. They are intermediates in the formation of what is actually used to make your muscles move, to help your brain think, to remember, to make your heart contract. And that currency is known as ATP. So to get from glucose or fats to ATP, the most efficient way to do that is within our mitochondria. And so this is really important for longevity, for mental health, for preventing heart disease, cancer, all this. Sick mitochondria generally are linked with all sorts of diseases, right? And it turns out that your mitochondria, because they're participating all this creation of cellular energy, and there's some exhaust, just like your car has exhaust, right? You're burning fuel. If you have an internal combustion engine, a gas-powered or diesel-powered car, you're creating that fuel to make the pistons go up and down, and that translates to the drive shaft and your wheels move. And a consequence of that is you have exhaust, right? So the more that we move and the more that we're trying to burn fat, the more exhaust we're going to have. And that exhaust is known as free radicals in the body, and that can damage your mitochondria. And what happens is when we get the accumulation of damaged mitochondria, they don't really work as well. And this is where exercise and fasting come in, because we get this process known as mitophagy. So autophagy is very specialized, and there's different types of autophagy, and a subset of autophagy is known as mitophagy. And essentially, when your mitochondria get a little bit too much exhaust because they're working hard, they should break down by way of mitophagy into their cellular components that can be recycled to make new healthy mitochondria. But if you're not exercising, if you're eating a standard American diet and just sitting around and over-consuming energy, those mitochondria can build up and create a litany of dysfunction. And this is known in the longevity research as cellular senescence. And so what can generally happen when you have mitochondrial dysfunction is your cells can become senescent. And these cells, because the organelles are misfunctioning, just like if your hot water heater leaked water all over the house and it got moldy, your house would be like, look, this is done for. We got to get rid of we can scrap some things in this house. We can't repair the entire house. We're just going to mow it over and reuse some of the components. If you don't, help purge these senescent deranged cells because the organelles are so damaged from use, they start to release senescent-like associated chemicals chemicals and cause the other cells to also misbehave and become senescent-like. And so you get accelerated aging. And this is what we see in the context of different pathological conditions, such as Parkinson's, such as dementia, such as heart disease, such as diabetes, such as obesity, is you get the accumulation of these damaged cells because the organelles within them are dysfunctioning, and it's just a ripple effect. And so the cool thing about both fasting and exercise, and in the context of weight loss, because we'll get to senescent cells in the fat tissue momentarily, we help to purge these senescent cells. And now there's all these different therapeutics, an old recycled cancer drug known as dasatinib and quercetin protocols, where people can take this and help to purge their cells. That's not my area of expertise at all. I like to rely more upon natural therapies, but that is out there. And so the thing with obesity and fat loss in particular is when we start to accumulate more fat, there's a dearth of oxygen delivery to that growing visceral adiposity, in particular, the belly fat. And you start to get more and more of these senescent dead cells and misbehaving cells. And so the adipose tissue is characterized by a lot of inflammation, a lot of infiltration of various immune cells that cause collateral damage in the body. And so this is why I think fat loss is really important and should be top of mind for preventing all the obesity-associated diseases, from heart disease, from cancer, to depression, anxiety, dementia, all that, because the fat is not inert. It's not just this unsightly thing that is hanging off our abdomen when we're at the beach. It is immunologically and cellularly active in a very negative way. And so the way that we can help our bodies function better is all these natural therapies that we've been talking about, Ben: low carb diets, intermittent fasting, compressing our feeding window, strength training, and also walking. So hopefully that was a condensed version of what you were getting at with the mitochondria.
Yeah, no, you laid it out really, really well. Yeah, I haven't heard one expert say, the mitochondria are not important, but I'm sure that might happen one day. I think we could all agree they are very important. So those are it's a great list of things for the audience to do to achieve health and fat loss, right? Exercise, walking, fasting, low carb. What about these different biohacks out there? We were just talking offline about, cold plunging and sauna. What have you seen with cold shock proteins, heat shock proteins, white fat, beige fat, brown fat? What have you seen with these hormetic stressors from biohacks like cold plunges and sauna helping us achieve more of a leaner body?
Yeah, it's a great question, Ben. We really don't have good evidence to suggest that fat loss is increased in an appreciable way through cold thermogenesis or cold water immersions. I think it does have more of a beneficial impact on the central nervous system in improving heart rate variability and stress response and overall physiologic resilience. If you look at these different diseases, whether it's obesity, diabetes, dementia, these people just lack resilience, and that's like you said, the study in 1981 with that lady who had people, just that perception. So people are like, oh, I'm so hot, I can't go outside and exercise. Oh, it's too cold, I can't possibly go walking in the snow. These are individuals who generally lack resilience. And so if we want to improve our resilience, this is where heat and contrast and cold therapy really come in, because they improve our body's ability to resist temperature extremes. And this, I think, is really important. There was a study back in 2011 that found that there was a strong correlation with household temperature and body weight, meaning that people that live in thermal neutral conditions generally weigh more than people who do not. And so I think that's really important, this thermal stress. And if we just think ancestrally, I mean, no matter where unless you live on the equator, you're going to have, ancestral humans would have to have some resilience to temperature variations, right? Because you'd have to go hunt and forage for vegetables or animals. If you live in Nebraska, it gets cold. If you live in Minnesota, if you live in, we've been talking about Italy, parts of Italy are in the Alps, parts of France, it gets very cold, right? So we have to be resilient to our environment. And in modern day society, we don't even really need to leave our house. Amazon can deliver everything we possibly could ask for. So we have these tools now to help us sort of impart the ancestral resilient futures that humans are accustomed to having. Animals of all kinds. You look at deer in the winter, I mean, they're troughing through 4 feet of snow in some places. Bears have to hibernate. That's a whole nother fascinating conversation, because bears, when they're hibernating, they don't lose muscle. It's really interesting. The fact, we can get into that later. But going back to your point, I don't think we have a lot of really good evidence to suggest that cold immersions enhance fat loss by way of cold thermogenesis. We do know that cold immersions significantly increase the conversion of white fat cells to behave more like brown fat tissue. It's called beiging. And they become enriched in the organ we just talked about, which is the mitochondria. That's how they get more brown like. And I think we do see improvements in metabolic health and blood sugar and so forth. But I think most of the benefits, honestly, although I do have videos talking about the enhancement, there is a transient increase in utilization of fatty acids in the post cold plunge window. But I think it's more mindset, rigor, mental resilience, and Ben, blood flow. This is what's really unique about the contrast. And when you talked about mitochondria, we've been talking about walking. Walking helps move your muscles and move blood, which is great, but also lymph. So as we know, the lymph is the sort of highway system of our immune system, and stagnant lymph, there's a huge body of research. We could do a 3-hour podcast on lymph stagnation and lymph drainage. I think the benefits of cold plunging is moving this lymphatic tissue that can become stagnant and therefore inflammatory. So when you get cold, blood is distributed from the periphery to your core. Your body's always trying to preserve the thermal homeostasis of the brain and of the vital organs, right? So blood is going to get diverted away from the periphery to the core. The inverse happens when you get hot. Blood is trying to get away from the core to the periphery. So you're literally massaging and moving by way of subtle muscular contractions when you're cold. I mean, the cold thermogenesis, like your muscles are slightly twitching like this. And so they're causing blood and lymph to move. And so I think for a lot of people, especially if you have a desk job or you drive or sit a lot, that is helping blood move around. And I think that's why we see 𝙎𝙬𝙍𝘍 in Finland has done a lot of research, epidemiological research on people who sauna. Basically, more is better. The more that you can sauna, the better it is in terms of preventing neurologic degenerative conditions, dementia, Parkinson's, but also heart disease. I think they also looked at an autoimmune condition, but death from all-cause mortality gets reduced. The more you sauna, I'm sure there's an inflection point where if you sauna multiple times a day, every day, you could lose minerals and so forth. But basically, 3 to 4 days a week for most people, 20 to 30 minutes is going to be sufficient, whether it's infrared or I have a wood-fired stove. It just depends on what your jam is. And I think the benefits of heat, we talked about cold for fat loss. The benefits of heat is it's mimicking what exercise does. Sauna is an exercise mimetic. So it's an agent that mirrors what exercise does because your muscles are moving a little bit, your cardiovascular output increases, you're moving a lot of blood around. And then again, if you get cold, you're moving that blood back to the core. So you're just redistributing blood and lymph throughout the body. And I think that's where a lot of the benefits come.
Well said. Okay, let's unpack some of that. So with cold exposure, whether it's a plunge or a cold body of water, your body is going into this hunter's reflex where it's diverting blood flow away from the extremities to the organs, giving you this vascular massage. It's vasoconstricting. Then when you get out of that cold plunge, then the blood flow goes out and it vasodilates. But if you could actually compare that with sauna or heat exposure, that's vasodilation. Your blood flow and circulation is you're allowing circulation and blood flow through your body more efficiently with vasodilation. So cells and tissues get more nutrients and healing. Yeah. Now, with the average person, I think you said earlier in the conversation, most people are getting like less than 3,000 steps per day, I think is what you said.
Yeah.
I would not recommend they start going and doing a 5-minute cold plunge, a 30-minute sauna. I would love for you to talk about building up this hormetic ceiling and how so many people, I believe in our space, Mike, don't even understand the term hormesis. They say they do, but I don't think they really do. So if you could explain it for a beginner to adapt to the stress properly so they don't actually hurt themselves with these biohacks.
Yeah, great question, Ben. So hormesis is basically the concept that a short-term acute stressor makes you more resilient and stronger over the long haul. And so if we think about we'll pick a polyphenol, anthocyanidins found in blueberries. That has a hormetic stressor on the body. These the blueberries develop this pigmentation that makes them blue, purplish, because they're exposed to the UV light of the sun. And so they're trying to avert some of the damage from the UV, and they create this pigment. It turns out that when we have this pigment, it's good for us indirectly because it's kind of mildly stimulatory to the cells and can create a little bit of inflammation, for example. So that's like a hormetic stressor in the diet. We can look at resveratrol, whatever. Exercise is a hormetic stressor. If you were to look at in real time your biologic functions during exercise, blood pressure, heart rate, glucose, insulin, adrenaline, noradrenaline, you'd be like, whoa, this is terrible for what is going on in the body? It looks terrible, right? Blood pressure increases, stroke volume increases, everything, adrenaline you'd be like, this is terrible. But it turns out exercise is really beneficial. So I think this concept of hormesis is helpful for people because when they hear about going in the cold plunge, you think, oh my gosh, cortisol is bad. No, chronic cortisol overexpression, chronic worrying, chronic traffic, chronic deadlines is bad. Short-term acute shifts in cortisol are very good. It turns out that eating is a hormetic stressor. Eating disturbs homeostasis in the body. And there's a Dr. Woods that published this research back in, it's like the 1990s, finding that, guess what? This demon known as cortisol, people are all scared about, it increases when you eat meals, right? So if people are scared about cortisol increases from cold plunging, they should never eat. They should never get out of bed because it turns out that when you wake up in the morning, guess what? You get a cortisol spike. You want the strong cortisol awakening.
And the sunshine gives you cortisol too, a cortisol spike. So you'd avoid the sun, you'd avoid everything.
Yeah. So anyway, I think that when people understand hormesis, they can differentiate short-term acute favorable stressors from chronic long-term stressors. So over-exercise, problematic. Excessive cold plunging, certainly problematic. But yeah, getting back to the practical nuts and bolts here, when it comes to cold immersion therapy, I suggest people start out with cold showers.
Yeah.
Or a cold lake, just start there, just see how you do. And because that's going to ease our body's resilience into that, and you'll be able to tolerate that more. And needless to say, there was a randomized controlled trial that looked at workers in a big corporate setting and found that people that took 3 to 5 cold showers a week at the end of the cold and flu season had less reported sick days compared to people who did not. So it affects the immune system. And I think that's good. We're hearing a surge of COVID, stuff going on here, cold and flu, even in the summer, et cetera. I think people should always be concerned about immune health. It's related to your metabolic health. So if nothing else, start with a cold shower. Then I encourage people to just do a small dip, in a cold plunge tank if you have access to it at, maybe 40 degrees. It doesn't have to be super cold. I have the Morozko Forge. It's at 36 degrees right now, 35 degrees, really cold. There's ice in it. I worked up to that. I was in 2017, I was doing the stock tanks in the backyard, sometimes getting ice bags, so, worked into it. And in the winter, I like to jump in rivers and stuff. I was just at an alpine lake the past 2 weekends and jumped in, and there was ice everywhere. So this was super, super cold, but I certainly wouldn't recommend someone who's never done this to do that, because in certain susceptible people, there can be a little bit of an arrhythmia going on in the heart. And I wouldn't want anyone to be, challenged cardiovascularly from that. So yeah, ease into it. Same with the sauna. If you've never done a sauna, going into 220 degrees with an assault bike like Laird Hamilton does, probably not a good idea.
Is that what he does?
I've heard this.
That's crazy.
Yeah, I've exercised in my sauna, and it's a wood-fired stove, so it gets hot. I've had it up at 240, and that was really, really, yeah. You're talking 2 minutes, and when you breathe, it kind of hurts. So I don't do that anymore. But I was just curious. I have some friends in the military that are really into this, and we challenge each other. But like we talked about, hormesis has a U-shaped curve. You can push things too far for sure.
Yeah, and I want to share a perfect example of this. Everybody has a different hormetic ceiling. Mike's hormetic ceiling is very, very high. He's built it up, and that's what you want to do, right? So you could do something like exercise in a sauna, 36 degrees plunge, but the average person cannot do that. Arguably, they're going to hurt themselves. And there's even 4 different anecdotal stories. So Dr. Rob Kamenarek, who's a friend of mine, he's a hormone expert. He told me he had 3 patients who suffered a stroke within minutes of doing cold plunge too much, cold plunge too soon, right? So there could be the potential for that when you do too much too soon. And my fiance's best friend, they had her do 3 minutes at 38 degrees her first time, and she got a panic attack, right? Because the coaches didn't understand hormesis, right? And then for my personal story, Mike, when I first met you in person, it was June or July of 2018. Do you remember when I was
in Kirkland, coffee shop.
Yeah, exactly, right? So I was going to Spokane for an event, and I was in Seattle, Kirkland, and I reached out to you, and you were really gracious. I said hello. You recommended Snow Lake Mountain to me and my friends to go hike.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I have a story here now, and I was just sharing this on stage at Hack Your Health, the story of violating hormesis. So I went to Snow Lake right after that recommendation, and we hiked. I think it took like an hour, maybe an hour and a half to get to the lake. One of the most beautiful places. It was a fantastic recommendation. One of the most beautiful places I've ever seen in my life. It was incredible. So at this point, I didn't understand hormesis. My hormetic ceiling was very low. I was still inflamed. I had 8 fillings in my mouth. I was living in a moldy home. I was burning myself out at my CrossFit gym, doing hard training. Like my hormetic ceiling was low. Didn't understand this back then. So I jumped into the lake for 30 seconds. And I have Raynaud's, which is an autoimmune disease. And I hop out of the lake after 30 seconds, and I look at my fingers, dude. And my fingers are white and purple. And if you're watching on YouTube, you could see from the tip all the way to around my wrist. And that was like the biggest Raynaud's flare-up I ever had in my life. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what's going on? I couldn't even close my hands. And I thought I was going to lose my hands. I was actually freaking out. So there was nobody around, it was just me and my 2 friends. They're laughing. They think it's funny. But I found some hikers, and I just asked hikers, do you have a lighter? I need a lighter. These hikers had a lighter, and I would just put the fire underneath my hands, and eventually the blood flow came back. Wow. Now, that was a valuable lesson for me because I learned that I did too much too soon, and I violated hormesis. Now, ever since then, I've gotten 8 fillings out of my mouth safely from a biological dentist. I've detoxed the mercury. I've done all these things for my health. Now, fast forward to last October 2023, I got my first plunge. I still have Raynaud's, although it's so much better, and the triggers are really not that common these days. But I don't really cold plunge because I'm worried about that being triggered again. So when I first got the plunge, I set it to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. I know that's not cold, but that's what I set it to. And I just did 1 minute. I'm just testing this out. I wanted to adapt to the stress. So I did 1 minute at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, and I actually got a mild Raynaud's flare-up from that, right? So I thought, interesting. Okay. 2 days later, I went back in, and I did the same thing. 70 degrees, 1 minute, no flare-up. Okay, my body adapted after 1 session. So then I kept dropping it down to 65 degrees at 30 seconds, flare-up, do it again, flare-up, do it again, no flare-up. Okay, then I kept dropping it. So now I'm at 48 degrees Fahrenheit. For me, it's pretty good. I did 4 minutes, no flare-up at all, right? Wow. So, and I know you talk about adapting to like if you have Raynaud's, adapting to the cold. So I'm not getting any flare-ups. Even at 48 degrees at 4 minutes, I'm rarely getting any flare-ups in general. So I share that so the audience can understand, like, this is how you adapt with hormesis and build that ceiling up higher.
I love that. Yeah, and there's actually good research now showing that exposure to cold actually helps with Raynaud's. Like you over time, not like you just slowly introduce this. And this makes a lot of sense if you think with exercise. If you've never done CrossFit, you wouldn't want to have someone do a Murph, or some crazy program. So yeah, you just ease your way into it, and be smart about it.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things I pay attention to personally to know if I'm adapting to the stress or not, I'm looking at my sleep that same night, my HRV, my resting heart rate. I want to see my resting heart rate in the low 40s, 41, 42 is where I'm optimal for me. I want to see my HRV above my baseline, which for me, my baseline is around 65, 70. So I want to see it above that or around the average. And I want to make sure I hit my deep and REM sleep targets. Like if I see that, even though like today I did the fasting, the workout, the plunge, the strength training, the basketball, and the sauna, if I see a good recovery tonight and I feel fine, then tomorrow I'll push it again. But if I don't, then that'll be a rest day. Are you doing similar metrics to see if you're recovering from workouts?
Yeah, great question. I used to use an Oura Ring, and I've had all the different versions of that. I don't so much anymore, Ben. It's more subjective. If I wake up feeling tired, I try to exercise every day, but it's not necessarily structured exercise. It might be pulling the sled in the front yard. I have a sled that I pull, or walking with a weighted vest. That would be a recovery day, or just a non-exercise day for me. But yeah, it really just depends on how I feel. And, because I find if I don't exercise at all, my sleep is not good. So I have to do something. And so I have a ski erg and a concept too. So I'll do some rowing, whatever, and just do lower watts, at 200 watts an interval for a minute, as opposed to 600 watts for 30 seconds. Right. So just changing the intensity and the volume. That's what I like to do.
I love it. And you're paying attention to how you feel. That's the most important thing. You want to feel better, not worse, right? If you feel worse, you did too much. If you're following a low carbohydrate, keto diet, or carnivore diet, this is one of the most important tips. I see a lot of people who struggle with keto and carnivore, and the reason they struggle is because they are losing too many electrolytes. They're becoming mineral depleted. Every cell in your body needs minerals to function, to produce energy, which helps you burn fat and feel good. My favorite minerals and electrolytes are from Beam Minerals. These are fulvic and humic compounds that are bioavailable, that have over 70 minerals in them. It tastes like water. They're carnivore friendly. Let me explain why. There are no anti-nutrients in them. It does not break a fast. As a matter of fact, it could support your fasting window. And it's been a game changer for my health, and I recommend it to all my students. Head over to beamminerals.com. Use the coupon code Azadi at checkout, my last name, Azadi at checkout, to get a nice discount. Beamminerals.com, coupon code is Azadi.
Yeah.
Let's transition to LDL cholesterol, just lipids in general, even though LDL is more of a protein, but lipids in general. You're writing a new book, which will be out tentatively December 2024, all about metabolic health and cholesterol. Let's talk about, you recently released a video outlining I believe it was a 22-year study, a follow-up on LDL cholesterol and cardiovascular, which is all cause mortality. I'd love for you to share your thoughts on where we are at right now with cholesterol and LDL.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Ben. In the academic peer-reviewed literature, it seems that there's kind of a bifurcation of these studies, meaning we see some studies showing there's a nonlinear association with LDL cholesterol and all-cause mortality and mortality from cardiovascular-related diseases and major cardiovascular events, such as having a heart attack or stroke. There's more of a J-shaped association, meaning that at lower levels of LDL cholesterol, it's not inherently protective, and it is in fact linked with actually an increased risk in various studies of premature death from heart disease and major adverse cardiovascular events. And so it's very interesting because at the same time, and I said bifurcation, because you have this epidemiological data coming out, and then you have this other data and various studies, and these are more narrative reviews. So thought leaders and consensus statements will be emerged from meetings and so forth, suggesting that lower LDL is better from the data that we know from familial hypercholesterolemia. And this is these are individuals who are genetically prone to have exceedingly high levels of cholesterol. And in some of those studies, those individuals do have higher rates of heart disease, more atherosclerosis, or plaque buildup in the arteries, and increased rates of death from heart disease. So, but in those studies, also there's fibrinogen and other biomarkers that are strongly tethered to the higher rates of heart disease, that when you control for those, the data isn't so solid. So I think it's quite interesting. And so what I like to do is just, share this with people so that they're a little bit more armed when they go to their doctor, because it turns out, the conventional thinking is because your liver makes this low density lipoprotein, or LDL cholesterol, which is involved in cholesterol transport from the liver to the rest of the body. And why does this matter? Well, because your blood is water based, your plasma blood is water based, and you need to shuttle fat soluble nutrients. Every cell needs cholesterol. Cholesterol is very important for cell repair. All of your cell membranes contain cholesterol. Cholesterol is a precursor for hormones. Cholesterol is important. You have to have it. So it has to be shuttled in this low density lipoprotein, as well as very low density lipoprotein. There's other atherogenic proteins that are related to LDL that are beyond the scope of this conversation, but we need this to get into our cells. And so how cholesterol gets into our cells is it gets out of circulation via a process known as transcytosis into the endothelial tissue. So if you think about your vessels and your arteries like a hose, on the inner part of the hose, there's a single layer known as the vascular endothelium. And for just so people can conceptually remember this, in research, the endothelium is characterized as ED. If we think about erectile dysfunction, that is characterized by
Yeah.
dysfunctional endothelial tissue, high blood
Same
pressure,
same pathway, right?
same mechanism, low nitric oxide production, poor vascular tone, essentially lack of resilience within your cardiovascular system. That's when we think of heart disease, that's essentially what it comes down to, because the vessels become very stiff and calcified after the low density lipoprotein, as I mentioned, gets into the endothelial layer where it's needed to offload the cargo. Cholesterol, vitamin K, coenzyme Q10, fat soluble vitamins, free fatty acids, etc. Right? But in some people, it can get stuck in there and it can become modified and stuck inside the endothelial tissue. And thereby it can create arterial plaque, which can lead to progressive narrowing of the artery, which can lead to complete blockage in the case of, say, a heart attack or a stroke, or it can lead to breaking off of a piece of plaque that can then cause a heart attack or stroke or loss of blood flow, right? So that's why the mainstream medical community is so concerned about this, because the LDL does get trapped in there. But 80% of the LDL leaves via a process known as endocytosis. So it just leaves, it dumps the cargo and leaves. So I think a better question is, what is the differentiating factor from causing that LDL to stay stuck in the vascular endothelial tissue and cause damage? And it turns out that oxidation of the LDL matters. And so there's all this confusion about polyunsaturated seed oils. What turns out that if you eat a diet rich in linoleic acid, it can render the low density lipoprotein to be more prone or susceptible to becoming modified or oxidized, and therefore initiate this process of plaque buildup. And I think that's really fascinating. And that might be, one of the reasons why we do see increased rates of cancer and other complications in people who have diets high in linoleic acid, for example. But also having high blood pressure, it turns out. So the higher your blood pressure is, even at low LDL cholesterol levels, there's a stronger correlation with atherosclerosis or plaque buildup of the arteries. Guess what? Poor metabolic health. We talk a lot about this, Ben, as you know, glucose and ketones and all these things. Well, if you have insulin resistance or diabetes, even at low levels of LDL cholesterol, that LDL cholesterol is more likely to cause atherosclerosis. So we got to start thinking outside the box and address, in my opinion, focus as much or more on the other factors that render LDL to become more likely to cause plaque buildup. And that is losing body weight. So obesity, we talked about high blood pressure. Smoking is an obvious one. So if you smoke or vape, even if it's marijuana or whatever, cannabis, please just don't do that. That's going to increase your risk of numerous diseases, including heart disease. And then also metabolic health and blood sugar. So these are really important. And I will add on, there's not as much evidence to support this, but increased blood viscosity from iron overload. And so supporting healthy hydration, making sure if you're on, a lot of guys now are on TRT and their hemoglobin hematocrits, RDWs are really high. Donating blood once or twice a year for men is important. And also postmenopausal women, because most women are actually trend towards anemia because they bleed every month if they're menstruating healthfully. And men, we don't bleed like that. So it is decreasing blood viscosity is important, because the shear stress of blood can cause the initial insult to the arterial wall, where LDL is implicated in the formation of atherosclerosis. So basically, then that's what the research, there's two schools of thought here. One is that we need to drop LDL to the floor, and anyone who has an LDL over 130 milligrams per deciliter is at high risk of heart disease, the pundits say. We have another school camp that shows that low LDL is not always better. In fact, half of people that end up in the ER or hospital with a major adverse cardiovascular event have low LDL cholesterol.
Yeah,
so
right.
That's important. Then we have this J-shaped association. Then we have this 35-year study that I love to share with people, following folks out of Sweden, finding that low LDL cholesterol levels after the age of 65 reduce the odds of reaching your 100th birthday. So on the one hand, you have all these people talking about blue zones and how important a plant-based diet is for blue zones. But if you look after the age of 65, higher LDL cholesterol levels and lower glucose levels were strongly independently correlated with greater statistical probability of living to be 100 years of age. And this is called the OMORIS cohort. AMORIS stands for the apolipoprotein mortality risk cohort. So this is an ongoing 35-year study out of Sweden. And so we have all this data, and basically honestly, it's confusing, Ben, because I like to read things impartially. I read the mainstream literature and it's like lower is better. this whole cholesterol exposure hypothesis, the cumulative exposure to LDL is bad, so lower is better. And I'm like confused. But then at the end of the paper, they're like, oh, and by the way, there are other factors that increase the likely of LDL to become problematic. And that is high blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, smoking. I'm like, well, why aren't we talking about that? 'Cause so many people have metabolic issues and high blood pressure.
So well said. It's there's a lot of moving parts to the conversation here, and guys like I don't know how you feel about Lane Norton. He's made like 8 or 9 videos of me. He's obsessed, but he's a very smart guy. I think but when he makes a video about me, I don't respond. I'm not that type of person. I have nothing but respect for him and everybody in the space. I think the real enemy is big pharma, but it causes me to pause and say, let me look into what I said, right? So the recent video that he made a video on me was me talking about this actually from Hack Your Health. And I was explaining that, look, if we're just looking at total cholesterol and total LDL, you're not necessarily getting the full picture. There's more moving parts to it. And it was a clip from a lecture, and he made a video saying, actually, it's been shown that high LDL is associated. It doesn't matter if it's the pattern A or pattern B. It's associated with higher mortality, right? So then it causes me to look, is there something that he saw that I didn't see? And then when I look I get confused too. But I think to your point, and I want you to add to what I'm about to say here, when we look at the full picture, we're looking at total cholesterol. We're looking at LDL, but the particle sizes of those LDL, the patterns, right? The NMR profiles, what I usually do. We're looking at HDL, triglycerides, and we're looking at fasting insulin, A1C, C-reactive protein, homocysteine. We're looking at the full picture. That would be the best way to assess if you're at risk of heart disease. Am I getting that right, Mike?
Yeah, Ben, I do think that is better. And I think the advocates and the consensus gurus that are writing out these statements for primary health professionals know that the average doctor visit is gone down from like 15 minutes to 7.5 minutes or something like that. So it needs to be so simple and algorithmic. And if this, then that. If cholesterol high, give this drug. It needs to be super simple. But this is a much more nuanced conversation, And so that a study just came out in asthmatics. This was published last week, finding that lower cholesterol levels in asthmatics increases the odds they will die over 5 years. And this was a 5-year follow-up study, and found that, look, if you have low LDL and you have asthma, you're more likely to die compared to if you have high LDL, because we're forgetting about the other functions of LDL. And we found this with COVID too, by the way. And people didn't know if the COVID infection caused LDL to suddenly and acutely drop, or if low LDL cholesterol caused people to be more acutely ill. But there was data really showing early on, and this was April of 2020. And I remember sharing this, and Lane blew up and so did Spencer Nildowski on Instagram. Well, you're sharing this stuff like you don't even know what you're talking about. It's like, look, the data really shows that LDL, these low density lipoproteins, even HDL, is involved in immune system function. These things neutralize pathogens, both bacteria and viruses. So if you have an immune issue such as asthma or scleroderma or psoriasis, right? You probably want a little bit higher LDL because your immune system is already being tugged and pulled in different directions. And it turns out that LDL is basically a sponge for pathogens, right? So that doesn't mean that you go out and eat extra bacon every day, right, to increase it. It's just like, you don't maybe take drugs to lower it because you're like, well, look, a little bit might be better, but it's also considering things in context, right? So Ben, like you mentioned, and Dr. 𝙎𝙐𝙎𝙎𝙎, many people have talked about this. I'm pretty sure you've had him on your show as well. LDL is problematic in people who are also insulin resistant in particular. So also have low HDL, high triglycerides, high glucose. So in that context, the metabolic milieu, they probably have high blood pressure too. Their LDL is going to be more problematic. So that is an individual who might benefit from LDL lowering while they also address the other underlying causes that are making that LDL more problematic. And that's the whole thing I think people don't focus on enough, is that we have to look at the other features that are making LDL problematic and address those simultaneously, because it turns out that the mainstream tool, the primary tool now to lower LDL cholesterol, is a statin. Many people know that. Well, a side effect of statins is diabetes and insulin resistance. So you're like, well, wait, we're giving a drug to lower the cholesterol, but at the same time, we're worsening an independent cardiovascular risk factor, and that's diabetes. You're like, this doesn't make sense. And Ben, this is not new. When I first got into this space back in 2006, I was working with a medical doctor and I was working with pre-diabetic subjects. and they were on thiazide diuretics to lower their blood pressure. Thiazide diuretics are known to increase insulin resistance, as are beta blockers. So people come in with insulin resistance and diabetes and weight loss intolerance. I'm overweight. My joints hurt from all this. And I'm like looking at the medication list. I'm like, beta blockers and thiazide diuretics, two drugs well known to increase insulin resistance and cause glucose mishandling to happen. I'm like, what the heck? And that was my first kind of introduction to this whole pharmacotherapy. And I was like red pilled right away. Like, oh, I see what's going on here. So anyway, because here, Ben, the thing is, people might think I'm making fun of medicine. There are other drugs that lower blood pressure that don't cause insulin resistance, such as ACE inhibitors, angiotensin receptor blockers, and calcium channel blockers that have a much better side effect to efficacy profile. So I'm like, why aren't doctors recommending those drugs? It was every single patient, it seemed, was on a thiazide diuretic and a beta blocker. But I'm like, wow, you could use an ACE inhibitor or an angiotensin receptor blocker. Like, what are we doing? Anyway, it's crazy.
That's it's crazy, and I believe it. That's wild. And to your point, like when I just did 90 days of carnivore, first time I did 90 days, I usually do 30 or 45 days. And I did lab test on day one, comprehensive lab panel. I did a stool test. I put on a CGM. So I got all this data, and I actually had my results are in. And by the way, for those watching and listening, the video is out on my results. It's coming out soon. By the time this is out, it'll be out. But I had Dr. 𝙎𝙐𝙎𝙍𝙍 come on a Zoom with me. I'm like, I could go over my lab results and I know what I'm looking at, but there's more authority when I have a heart surgeon who operates on hearts, who understands cardiovascular health, look at my labs and give me his input, right? So I had him do that, and it's a part of the video on the podcast. And my total cholesterol on day one was around 330, I believe, 330-ish. It went to 450 on day 90. My total LDL was 220 on day one. Day one was me doing mostly keto, 5 days out of the week, flexing out 2 days out of the week. So that's what day one looked like for the past few months before I did carnivore. But my LDL went from 220 to 350 on day 90. Yeah. However, my fasting insulin was 3.4 on day one and 3.4 on day 90. My A1C was 5.2 on day one and 5.1 on day 90. My C-reactive protein was 0.4, I believe, on day one, and then 0.45 on day 90. So it went up like slightly. My homocysteine was 9 and went down to 6 on day 90. So all roads show, and by the way, my LDL, we did the particles, and 90% plus of the particles were pattern A. Only a small percentage was pattern B. So at the end of the conversation, Dr. Azadi essentially said this: you were at low risk of heart disease on day one, and after doing 90 days of nothing but fat and protein, carnivore, you're at even lower risk. So that is an example of doing all the markers to see what is actually going on.
Yeah, good.
Have you done something similar to like an extensive animal-based diet or a carnivore diet and looked at labs?
Yeah, I have. I've been running my lab since I was 26, so I have a lot of data there. Yeah, my LDL's increased a little bit. My triglycerides have continuously gone down, and my glucose has stayed the same, for the most part. And my hemoglobin A1C bounces around between like 5.2 and 4.9, something like that. My C-reactive protein has always been low. My liver enzymes have decreased. So, yeah. But I've worked with clients like this over the years. And when some people go carnivore because they are a lean mass hyperresponder, they have increases in both LDL and HDL, but a significant reduction in triglycerides, which, essentially means that they are relying more upon fat for fuel. And so, yeah, I've seen LDL as high as 400 in people. But like other biomarkers are significantly reduced or improved. And most importantly, they feel better. I mean, this is the thing. It's like, no one says anything when you're eating McDonald's and Mountain Dew, but then suddenly you eat a bunch of red meat. It's like, whoa, you're going to clog your arteries. I'd like to share a study that was published in New England Journal of Medicine that found that what leads to coronary artery constriction, and that's concerning, especially if you have coronary artery plaque, is high post-meal glucose. It has nothing to do with LDL cholesterol. So if you want to really constrict your arteries and maybe increase your risk of having a heart attack or a major adverse cardiovascular event, even like a stroke, go have some Mountain Dew and Chick-fil-A, and you will literally cause your arteries to constrict more, which is not good. So, yeah, I think it's more nuanced, Ben. That's what it comes down to.
It does. And I like doing, and of course, this is my own experiment. It's not going to be duplicatable for somebody else. But my HDL was in the 70s, both day 1 and day 90. Triglycerides were under 70, both day 1 and day 90. So everything looked great. One of the interesting things was the stool test, Mike. I did a gut test with Tend Health. Dr. 𝙎𝙐𝙎𝘎𝙬 told me to use this company. And it was a stool test looking at, of course, the different ratios between different bacteria, but also diversity. And I know that we're still like in the really beginning stages of understanding the gut microbiome. I think we actually spoke about this when I first interviewed you. But one of the interesting things was when I did the stool test on day 1, the results came back about 3 weeks and already into my carnivore experiment. And it said essentially that my diversity was okay. Some of the ratios with the bacteria were okay, not dangerous, but not optimal. But the suggestions were to do less of a ketogenic diet, less meat, more of these polyphenols, more of these plants and these fibers to create more of a diverse microbiome. And I did the complete opposite because this is day 1 of me going 90 straight days of no fiber or very minimal fiber, just meat. And on day 90, when I retested, I developed 7 keystone bacteria on day 90 that were not there on day 1, and 5 core bacteria on day 90 that were not shown there on day 1. So the chief scientific officer for the company, Dr. William DiPaolo, he wanted to review this with me because he saw it and he knew my experiment. And it changed the way he even looks at gut health because it goes against what most people think. To improve gut health, you need to have plants and polyphenols and fiber. So where are you at with the gut microbiome these days, and what are you seeing with carnivore and the gut microbiome?
Well, that's amazing, Ben. I haven't heard or seen anyone actually do any stool testing. I think that's really fascinating. I don't know. I like you think that we are in the infancy of really understanding what's going on. From what I have read, and I've read a lot of different articles, with the gut microbiome and followed the Human Gut Microbiome Project since it started in 2012 and all that, more diversity is better. But there is some keystone species like Akkermansia muciniphila. And, what Zhang Ro, who does a lot of research in keto, has found is like a keto diet will increase some of these health promoting keystone species in the gut, such as Akkermansia. So, I think what is bad for the microbiome is a standard American diet, from multiple different facets, whether it's glyphosate or Roundup, the microplastics, food additives, dyes, coloring, all this stuff. So, it's interesting, that going carnivore had such a profound effect on your microbiome. And I'm not surprised by that. If you look at hunter-gatherer peoples, it would be, I don't know, in the winter, what are you going to eat, in Minnesota, in Wisconsin, in parts of Europe, so it's going to be meat and broths and cheese and milk and things like that, or things that you could have preserved. And maybe there's some amounts of fermented vegetables or cured meats or cured vegetables, whatever. So I do think that eating a more ancestral diet is going to be supportive of the microbiome. I don't know. But the thing that I think is quite curious is, just anecdotal reports of people who have IBS or Crohn's, who are on a vegan diet and have a very diverse array of fiber, different types of fiber, insoluble versus soluble fiber, different polyphenols. They have terrible gut health, oftentimes. And then when they go carnivore or keto, their gut health improves. So it really flies in the face of, everything that we've been purportedly told about what improves health of the microbiome. And that is a diverse array of plants and plant matter, different types of fiber, all this. So I think, honestly, we have more questions than answers when it comes to the microbiome at this point.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. I have a couple more things before we land this
Sure.
metabolic plane together. What are your thoughts these days on vegetables and plants and anti-nutrients? I know that we have guys like our mutual friend Ken Berry and Dr. 𝙎𝙐𝙎𝘎𝙬 and Sean Baker, who eat a carnivore diet. They avoid these anti-nutrients. Dr. Shafi talks about this a lot too, and how these are plant toxins and they're poisoning us. And then we have people who think that, and I'm in this camp that I'm explaining here, that they're probably detrimental if you have some sort of leaky gut and gut dysbiosis, and it's a good idea to remove them and work on your gut. But there could be, this is my thoughts, I want to hear your thoughts, there could be a hormetic benefit to these plant toxins. And it's different for everybody, and your gut microbiome will determine whether or not you can or should have them. I believe in that second part. What are your thoughts these days with plant toxins?
Yeah, I agree with the latter. I think it really is very personal. I don't think every single plant or vegetable has, is out to kill you and harm and poison you. I do think that there are vegetables that are health promoting, and I think that people have like a different ceiling or threshold for different types of vegetables and things like that. I do think that people overemphasize vegetables. They go to the store, they get the big bag of salad that's shrink wrapped in plastic and was probably grown in Ecuador or whatever, who knows. So I think that there are unintended harms with vegetables for sure. It's probably how we're growing them. We're eating them out of season. Vegetables aren't grown year round unless they're in a hop house. Oftentimes they're grown in Latin America and shipped here and ripened with ethylene gas. So it's just like there's heavily sprayed. I mean, you can go to the USDA website and look up celery and how many millions of pounds of insecticides, herbicides, and fungicides are sprayed on just something like celery or radishes or carrots or potatoes. I mean, it's insane the amount of stuff that we're spraying on these vegetables. There's been books about it. There's a book called The Fateful Harvest. There's this loophole with the USDA where toxic chemicals from industrial waste companies like 3M and aluminum smelter plants, they can put that in fertilizer, right? And that's because they want to disperse it. It's more expensive for them to dispose of this stuff the proper way. So heavy metals and all this crap from metal manufacturing and other industrial manufacturing are sprayed on our food, and it's totally legal. And
Jeez.
This has been documented in this book, Fateful Harvest. So we see this increase. It's called early onset cancer. There's all these cancers emerging in people who historically would never age categories that would never get cancer. The question is why? So I don't think it's, having ribeyes or avocados or whole egg yolks. I think there's probably more to the story. And so that's the downside of some of these vegetables. So in a way they can be poisonous. So I think that people should be buying their vegetables from a local farmer's market, eat what is in season. Don't strive to hit certain thresholds of fiber, especially if you have GI issues. Just eat, and try to eat what's available to you seasonally, right? So where you live, Ben, you have a greater window of fruit availability. I think you should embrace that. If you live in Costa Rica, you're going to have fruit year round. Eat it. I think it's fine, unless you're diabetic, overweight, or have all these autoimmune issues, right? So I think it's very personal and regionally specific. And I think we get into problems when we start to have dried mangoes on Christmas because it's a fruit or whatever, or pineapple imported from Lord knows where in January. Like, if you live in North Dakota, there's no pineapples growing around you. So you shouldn't be consuming that, because studies in bears and other hibernating animals, we adapt to our environment. Our microbiome changes seasonally, and part of that microbiome shift affects our metabolic aspects. So that's my thought on it. It should be more seasonal and more personal.
I love it. Great thoughts there. And you're right. Here in Miami, it's avocado and mango season right now. I have a big mango tree in front of my house, and it's got all these mangoes on it. So I'm going to eat these mangoes for sure. I'm going to enjoy it because I'm metabolically healthy. You mentioned smoking and vaping as a cause of increased risk of disease. What are your thoughts on not smoking and vaping, but nicotine and supplementation sprays, nasal sprays, what are they called? What are they called?
There's lozenges.
Lozenges, that's the word I was looking for. Yeah. So what are your thoughts on nicotine? I know that it's a mitochondrial uncoupler, it's a nootropic, and there's some benefits depending on the dosage. So have you done some research into nicotine at all?
Yeah. So I think it's important for people to understand tobacco-free nicotine is what we're talking about. So we're not talking about chewing tobacco or smoking. Tobacco-free nicotine does have some health benefits. It improves the parasympathetic tone, the vagal nerve. The thing is, it's highly prone to addiction. Many people overdo Zins and all these different things, but there's some different nootropics out there that are blending methylene blue with nicotine, with caffeine and things like that I think have value. I use them before I record, before I go on stage. I found some value with that. It does increase dopamine, so therefore it can be addictive. And so I think people should be mindful of that. There is some evidence that nicotine does cause vasoconstriction and might have some issues long-term and so forth. But I think people should just be mindful about this and see if it works for them. I think, it does have a mild appetite suppressant effect. You often hear people quit smoking and they gain a bunch of weight. So I think probably a little bit of tobacco-free nicotine is better than McDonald's or ice cream, Dairy Queen. But yeah, I just I do think they have potential for abuse. So I think people need to be mindful there about how they use them. But as a nootropic and cognitive enhancement, I think it's much better than say Adderall or some of these stimulants. So
Yeah, well said. So I use a product from, you know who Dr. John Lawrence is? Are you familiar with him? Dr. John
no.
Lawrence? Okay, he's like a mad scientist. He has a clinic in Sarasota. He makes a product called Zen. I know you said Zen, that's a different product, but this is called Zen. And it has oxytocin. It has nicotine, but it's taken from 𝙎𝙬𝙍𝙬, so it's tobacco nicotine, and it's a nasal spray. And I feel incredible when I take this, and I use it cyclically, to your point, because I don't want to take it all the time. But me and my fiance use it. I'll do it before I have a recording session or before I hit the stage, like you said. Like, it really puts me in a good zone. I'm on an off cycle right now. This is empty. I'm on an off cycle right now, but I don't really notice any changes. Like, I've heard that nicotine addiction could be severe, and I could take 2 weeks off, 3 weeks off. I don't really notice anything physiologically. I do notice that it's like a habitual thing for me to do it, and there's like a mental component there. Maybe I might be a little bit more irritable at times without the nicotine, I think because it's a dopamine thing. But have you noticed any like withdrawal symptoms when you go on an off cycle from nicotine use?
No, I personally have not. But I do know, I mean, I've been around people who are addicted to Zins, and it's like a constant thing they have to have all the time. I have some friends that play golf and they use Zins all the time. And I think Zins probably, I've tried it a few times and those are terrible, man. I've got instant buzz, instant stomach ache. I feel dizzy and nauseous. So,
and you're saying Zyn, not Zen, to be clear.
Zynn. So these are all
right.
the gas stations and things like that. Yeah.
Right. That's what I see. Yeah. I haven't tried that before.
Yeah. I think, and they might put shards of glass in there or something. I don't know. It's really because I've had a 6 milligram and a 3 milligram, and which is low dose nicotine. And both times I immediately felt dizzy and lightheaded. So, that's a really low dose of caffeine or nicotine. So yeah, I don't know what they do, but I think people should be maybe curious about it. Be mindful if they have a very addictive personality that, they might want to crave these things. But there's a brand that I was introduced to in 2022 called Nick Nack. Nick, Niknak, Nick Nack Naturals. They're out of Spokane, Washington. And so they make a nice tobacco-free nicotine.
Oh, cool. I'm going to check them out. So you're opposed to all tobacco nicotine, even
Well,
one that's...
𝙎𝙬𝙍𝙬 is cool. Because it's not, you're not smoking it. It is in the nasal cavity and things like that. I don't know. To me that would, and I've tried that once or twice. It's cool. I mean, for sure.
You've tried this specific product or 𝙎𝙬𝙍𝙬 in general? Okay, 𝙎𝙬𝙍𝙬.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be curious more about that one. But yeah, I don't know. Long term, just in nasally inhaling the stuff. I don't know. I think it'd be more for me a ceremonial thing a couple times a year. I don't know. I haven't looked at the research on that, but there is this link with tobacco and cancer, right? So I don't know what it is. Is it the additives? Is it the stuff they spray on tobacco? Is it
right? Yeah.
I don't know.
Mike, share with those watching and listening where they could learn more about you, share your podcast and your website.
Sure. Thanks, Ben. It's High Intensity Health. So HIGH Intensity Health, both on YouTube and then that's my website. The only thing that's different is on Instagram, it's metabolic_Mike.
We'll put all that down below. Definitely subscribe to Mike's YouTube channel. It's a fantastic resource. He's been very consistent for many years. It's High Intensity Health on YouTube. Podcast is the same name. Last final quick question here. I'm writing this book that I mentioned on metabolic health called Metabolic Freedom with Hay House, and it's due June 2025. It's all about the metabolism, and there's a chapter on supplements, and one of the supplements is a supplement called vitamin G, and I call it vitamin G because it's vitamin gratitude and all the benefits that the health benefits that you achieve when you feel and experience gratitude, what I call vitamin G. So Mike, what do you have vitamin G for today, my friend?
Ben, this is a really good question. Just the summer and the sun. I love the Seattle summers, and yeah, just being present with my daughter. We're going to nationals in Texas,
Right.
and so we're spending a week. I rented a place that has a little pool, so we can just chill out in between her events and stuff like that. So yeah, just being present and grateful to have a healthy kid. I think a lot of people are anxious. This is a long-winded way of getting back to your question, but I think a lot of people have anxiety and lack of they have mental illnesses, if you will, and not a lot of mental stability because they don't have children. Children provide a lot of they make you so much more present. They help repair the issues that you had with your parents, because you realize, like, as a parent, you're parenting on the fly imperfectly. And so when your mom or dad, lost their temper with you back in 6th grade and you remembered that, you're like, oh, well, I just did that with my daughter now. So I think there's a lot of benefits to this, getting back to the family unit and having community, eating dinner together and all that. So I'm just grateful, to have a healthy kid and to have sunshine. And I try to just be present every day and grateful for, just health in general.
If you enjoyed that conversation, you're gonna love a recent interview I did with Dr. Ben Bikman about the surprising ways to burn belly fat.
These are disorders that our ancestors would have never known. At the risk of being political, this is one of the consequences of capitalism, where capitalism is so good at improving people's lives that now we're suffering maybe the one consequence of it, which is that we have too much.